London had known the sound of marching feet before. British boots on old cobblestones, the rhythm of regiments leaving for France in the last war, the shuffling pace of Home Guard drills in the parks. But in early 1942, when a new sound echoed through the capital, it carried a different weight, a different promise, and a different future. It was the sound of men who had crossed an ocean not as visitors, not as traders, but as allies whose presence signaled the beginning of a new chapter in a war that had nearly broken the world. These were American troops, the young faces of a nation that had been attacked, awakened, and hurled into global conflict. And London, scarred, weary, but unbowed, watched them with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Winston Churchill watched too. For 2 years, he had lived inside the war like a man sealed inside a storm. Endless nights in bomb shelters, ceaseless telegrams from distant fronts, the weight of an empire trembling under strain. He had rallied Britain with words and fire, but even he could not ignore the brutal arithmetic of war. Britain was stretched thin. The Soviet Union was bleeding on the Eastern Front. The Axis seemed to grow stronger by the month. And now, finally, a new force was arriving, not in speeches or promises, but in marching columns of young Americans whose boots struck London streets with a confident, almost defiant energy. The city felt the change instantly. Londoners who had become experts at rationing hope now found themselves swept into a moment that felt unexpectedly emotional. There were cheers, real ones, not the brittle, rationed enthusiasm of wartime survival. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders to see uniforms. That looked familiar only from newspapers. Women waved handkerchiefs and flags. Shopkeepers abandoned their counters. Even the famously stoic policemen allowed themselves quiet smiles as the Americans passed. It wasn't only excitement. It was relief disguised as celebration. For too long, Britain had stood alone. The Blitz had shaken London to its foundations. Coventry had burned. Plymouth had been bombed repeatedly. Every family carried a private list of losses. But now, for the first time, the war didn't feel like a lonely struggle. The march of American troops through London was more than a parade. It was the physical manifestation of a promise. You are not alone anymore. Churchill had believed in the power of Allied unity long before it was fashionable. He had pleaded with Roosevelt for material aid, for ships, for planes, for anything that could keep Britain's defenses alive while the Axis advanced across continents. But even Churchill, ever the strategist, ever the realist beneath the bravado, knew that supplies alone could not turn the tide. Victory required men. Victory required coordinated armies. Victory required a shared burden. When he saw American soldiers marching past him for the first time, the weight on his shoulders shifted, if only slightly. He had been informed of their arrival, of course. He had read the cables, seen the manifests, approved the plans. But information is not the same as presence. The sight of thousands of Americans marching confidently through the city he had sworn to protect at all costs struck him with a force no document could ever match. Many eyewitnesses later remarked that Churchill's expression softened in a way rarely seen during those grim years. There was pride there, certainly. There was gratitude. But there was also something deeper, a flicker of vindication. He had held the line long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Britain had survived long enough for the tide to shift. The Americans themselves marched with a particular swagger, an unintentional one, born not of arrogance but of youth and energy. They were taller on average than the British soldiers who lined the streets. Their uniforms were new, their boots less worn, their shoulders unburdened by 2 years of bombing. Many Londoners later recalled that the Americans looked like they had stepped out of a different world, a world untouched by air raid sirens, ration books, and blackout curtains. And yet here they were, ready to share the burden. Churchill watched them with a slow, reflective gaze. He understood better than anyone what this march meant strategically. American manpower, American industry, American energy. The war was no longer a British struggle with American support. It was becoming an Allied war with shared leadership. The Prime Minister's mind rarely stopped calculating. Even in moments like this, moments that stirred emotions in ordinary people, he was thinking, several moves ahead. What would American presence mean for the timing of future offensives? How would joint operations be organized? What compromises would be necessary? What opportunities would open? But beneath the chessboard of his thoughts lay something more human, more vulnerable, and more profound. For the first time since he had taken office, Churchill felt that the future had opened slightly, not fully, not safely, but enough to let one breath of hope through the storm. The march of American troops was not victory, not yet, but it was the beginning of a future in which victory became imaginable. Londoners around him sensed it too. The city had known endurance. It had known courage. It had known the will to fight alone. But endurance is not the same as momentum. Courage is not the same as strength. And fighting alone is not the same as fighting together. As the Americans marched, shop windows reflected rows of khaki that seemed to stretch endlessly. Flags rippled in the cold wind. The columns moved with synchronized precision, an ocean's worth of distance overcome by purpose. And somewhere in the back of Churchill's mind, a truth crystallized. History was shifting under his feet. He did not smile broadly. He did not shout. He did not make a grand speech. Observers described him standing steadily, almost solemnly, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. And yet his face carried a look of recognition of fate arriving in boots and helmets, recognition of a new alliance taking physical form, recognition that the war had passed a turning point, unseen but deeply felt. What Churchill said that day would be remembered not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it captured a moment history rarely grants. The moment a leader sees the future begin to change. The march continued through London like a river of determination, flowing past landmarks that had survived fire and falling steel. American flags intertwined with Union Jacks in the hands of civilians, who had come to witness something they instinctively knew was historic. The city, still bruised from the Blitz, seemed to lift itself as the columns passed. Buildings cracked by explosions, windows repaired with tape, and streets once littered with rubble now stood as silent witnesses to a moment that felt like a turning point. In those streets, Londoners who had long fought to maintain their morale felt a surge of energy, a rekindling of spirit that no propaganda poster could have delivered. Churchill stood before this spectacle with a gaze sharpened by experience. Few men understood the precariousness of Britain's position as he did. Every report he had read, every strategy meeting he had attended, every sleepless night studying maps and casualty lists had hammered into him the truth. Britain could not win this war alone. Britain had endured. Britain had resisted. Britain had refused to fall. But endurance is not victory, and resistance is not conquest. The war demanded more than courage. It demanded power, vast, industrial manpower-rich power that only one nation in the world possessed in overwhelming quantity. And now that nation had arrived. As the marching units moved in perfect formation, Churchill recognized each symbol on their uniforms, divisional patches, new equipment, polished helmets reflecting weak winter sunlight. He saw young faces, unlined by the hardship British soldiers had endured since 1939, yet determined in their own way. Some of these men had left farms in Iowa, factories in Detroit, offices in New York, small towns scattered across a continent. Most had never seen Europe. Many had never left their home state before they boarded a ship bound for a world at war. Yet they marched with the confidence of men who knew the purpose of their mission. London's reaction to them was more than admiration. It was gratitude born from exhaustion. For months upon months, the capital had lived under the constant threat of death. Air raid sirens disrupted sleep. Anti-aircraft guns thundered in the night. Fires consumed streets and shelters became second homes. Families carried the emotional scars of cities bombed beyond recognition. In that long twilight of fear, seeing new allies arriving in force felt like witnessing dawn after a night that refused to end. Churchill watched ordinary people lean forward, wave, cheer, and cry. Elderly men who had fought in the Great War nodded with recognition, remembering foreign allies marching alongside them a generation earlier. Children scrambled for vantage points. Women clutched their coats, tighter against the cold winds, gusting down the streets, their faces lit with cautious hope. This was not simply a crowd welcoming soldiers. It was a nation welcoming a new reality. What struck Churchill most in that moment was the symbolism. The British Empire had once been the center of the world, projecting power across oceans. Now, in its hour of danger, another power had come, not to replace Britain, but to reinforce it. The march signaled that the burden of global conflict would no longer fall disproportionately on one island, nation and its dominions. The war had truly become a shared struggle, shaped by nations united in purpose rather than isolated by geography. The Americans carried themselves with a kind of relaxed discipline Churchill found intriguing. Their precision was undeniable, yet their posture held a casual ease compared to the rigid formality of European armies. Londoners noticed it too, some with amusement, others with admiration. These soldiers walked differently, talked differently, and carried a different cultural rhythm. Their presence brought new sounds to the streets, new accents, new slang, new energy. The war had grown stale and grueling, but the Americans injected it with something unfamiliar but desperately needed: freshness. Churchill's eyes followed the leading officers as they marched past him. He recognized the crisp salute, the disciplined movement, but he also sensed something beneath the surface: confidence. Not arrogance, not naivete, but the confidence of a nation whose industrial capacity was unmatched, whose factories roared with production, whose workers labored around the clock to build the arsenal that could reshape the war's outcome. He had visited American factories himself. He had seen entire warehouses filled with aircraft engines, tanks rolling off assembly lines, ships being launched in astonishing numbers. He knew that behind every one of these marching soldiers was a force so immense that the Axis powers could not truly comprehend it. For Churchill, the march wasn't simply military. It was psychological. It was diplomatic. It was strategic. It was proof that the long months of negotiation, the careful cultivation of Roosevelt's support, and the relentless lobbying for American involvement had borne fruit. The alliance he had envisioned, sometimes desperately, sometimes boldly, was no longer theoretical. It was marching in front of him in the thousands. As more units passed, Churchill reflected on how the war had evolved to this point. Britain's stand in 1940 had inspired admiration, but also skepticism. Some believed Britain would fall. Some believed Germany would dominate Europe unchallenged. Some doubted that America would ever send its sons to fight on European soil again after the heartbreak of the First World War. The isolationist mood in the United States had been strong, reinforced by memories of trenches, gas, and unimaginable loss. Churchill had watched that isolationist sentiment with frustration, knowing that if America remained distant, Britain's odds of survival would diminish. Then came Pearl Harbor. The attack had changed everything, not gradually, not in diplomatic increments, but instantly. America woke to a world in which distance no longer guaranteed safety. In the days that followed, Churchill had crossed the Atlantic to meet Roosevelt, forging bonds of strategy and trust that would shape the next 3 years of war. Their partnership had been rooted in mutual understanding. Churchill needed America, and Roosevelt needed Britain to stand long enough for American power to be fully deployed. Now, watching the Americans march, Churchill saw the fulfillment of those early agreements. The alliance was no longer held together by speeches and signatures. It was now cemented by soldiers prepared to fight and bleed beside the British. The Americans continued through London's core, past Trafalgar Square, where Nelson's column rose like a guardian over the city, along streets where buses once burned during raids, near buildings still bearing the scars of bomb blasts. Every step they took carried symbolic weight. They marched through the heart of Britain's resilience, through the city that had endured the fury of the Luftwaffe and refused to break. Churchill understood symbolism intimately. He had built his leadership on it. The first year of his prime ministership had been a struggle of words as much as policy. He had used language to fortify morale, to awaken stubbornness in a battered people, to convince them that they could stand when the world expected them to fall. Now, without a single word spoken, the Americans were delivering a new kind of symbol, one that his people could see, hear, and feel. And yet there was another side to the moment that Churchill perceived with his characteristic insight. This alliance would not always be simple. Americans fought differently. They negotiated differently. They approached strategy with energy, but also a determination to assert their growing influence. Churchill knew that cooperation would require patience, diplomacy, and compromise. But none of these concerns overshadowed the deeper truth standing before him. Britain finally had the partner it needed. The longer the march continued, the more Londoners realized the magnitude of what they were witnessing. This was the beginning of a transformation, not only of military capability, but of the emotional landscape of the war. For the first time in years, the oppressive weight of isolation began to lift from the British psyche. The war was still vast, still deadly, still uncertain, but the burden no longer rested on British shoulders alone. Churchill felt the shift inside himself. He felt the storm clouds of responsibility lighten. The endless pressure on his decisions softened slightly. He had borne the weight of a nation through its darkest hours, and now, at last, he sensed that the load would be shared by a nation powerful enough to carry half the world with it. He inhaled deeply, letting the moment settle. He rarely allowed himself to relax, even inwardly. But as the Americans marched, creating a rhythm that echoed through London's winter air, he felt something unusual, something he had nearly forgotten: reassurance. Not certainty, because war never offers certainty, but reassurance that the war was no longer drifting toward calamity. It was beginning to move toward possibility. And as the final battalions passed, Churchill realized something essential. History had pivoted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively. When the echo of marching boots finally began to fade into the distance, London seemed to breathe again, as if the city itself had paused to absorb the meaning of what it had witnessed. The crowds did not disperse immediately. People lingered on the sidewalks, exchanging words spoken with a quiet urgency. Observations about the Americans' height, their confidence, the shine of their equipment, the almost cinematic quality of their presence. Some described the march as the most hopeful sight they had seen since the first day of the war. Others simply stood in silence, letting the emotion of the moment settle over them like the first rays of sunlight after a long, unbroken night. Churchill, however, did not move. He remained rooted in place, riveted by the fading lines of soldiers who were disappearing around a bend in the street. His thoughts extended far beyond the spectacle. He was already imagining those same soldiers fighting in North Africa, then in Italy, then in France. He pictured them landing on beaches under fire, advancing through hedgerows, crossing rivers, pushing back the tide that had threatened to swallow the world. He imagined American bombers and British bombers flying in formation, their combined power shattering the industrials. Backbone of the Axis. He saw German generals staring in disbelief at maps showing American divisions arriving faster than they could be countered. He saw the war shifting, slowly but relentlessly, toward favor. But Churchill's understanding of the moment went even deeper. He understood that wars are not won solely by strategy or firepower, but by belief, by the conviction among a nation's people that victory is possible. For 2 years, Britain had sustained itself on sheer determination, on a stubborn refusal to concede defeat. But determination is a finite resource. Even the strongest people grow weary. Even the bravest begin to question. The sight of the Americans had injected the British spirit with something far more powerful than encouragement. Validation. Validation that their struggle had not been pointless. Validation that their sacrifices had not been in vain. Validation that their refusal to surrender had inspired a giant across the sea to rise, to march, and to join them. Churchill finally turned away from the street, the corners of his expression shaped by something somber and thoughtful. He was not prone to sentimentality, yet even he felt the emotional undercurrent of what he had just witnessed. The Americans had not come to rescue Britain. They had come to stand beside Britain. That distinction mattered deeply to him. It preserved British pride even as it fortified British strength. It maintained the dignity of a nation that had fought alone when others faltered. And it preserved the spirit of partnership that would define the alliance in the years to come. As Churchill walked away from the parade route, he felt the familiar weight of leadership settle back on his shoulders. But it no longer pressed as heavily. The war was far from over. There would be new battles, new disasters, new moments of doubt. There would be disagreements with American commanders, conflicts of personality, clashes of strategy. But none of that diminished the reality carved into the memory of this day. Britain would no longer face the darkness alone. In the days that followed, London buzzed with stories about the Americans. Newspapers printed photographs of the parade. Shopkeepers told customers about the soldiers' smiles. Children drew pictures of columns of men marching beneath flags. Restaurants and pubs spoke of the influx of new faces and different accents. British soldiers, hardened by years of war, assessed their new allies with curiosity and respect. Some joked about American optimism. Others admired their energy. Many felt a rising sense of comradeship, an understanding that, despite their differences, both nations were now tied to the same fate. For the British military leadership, the arrival of American forces represented not only manpower, but a shift in the balance of global power. Churchill understood, better than most, that the emergence of the United States as a dominant force in the war would reshape the political landscape of the future. Empires would fade, new alliances would form. The world after the war would not resemble the world before it. The old order was already crumbling, and the march of American troops through London symbolized that transition as clearly as any diplomatic declaration. And yet, Churchill did not resist this change. He embraced it. He saw in the United States a partner whose values aligned with Britain's own: aspirations, democracy, resilience, and a fierce commitment to resisting tyranny. While he knew that the empire he had grown up in would not survive in its old form, he also understood that the alliance between Britain and America offered something far more enduring than colonial influence, a bond forged in crisis, strengthened in sacrifice, and solidified in the fires of a shared struggle for global freedom. In the privacy of his thoughts, Churchill reflected on how differently history might have unfolded had Britain fallen in 1940, had the Luftwaffe achieved air superiority. Had the Royal Navy been crippled, had morale broken, the Americans might have faced a world dominated by the Axis, a world in which launching a counteroffensive across an ocean would have been nearly impossible. But because Britain had endured, sometimes by courage, sometimes by chance, sometimes by sheer stubbornness, The world had reached a moment where reinforcements could march openly through London, rather than fight desperately to retake it. He thought of the sacrifices that made this moment possible. The fighter pilots of the Battle of Britain, the civilians who endured the Blitz, the sailors who died keeping supply routes open, the soldiers who fought in North Africa and Greece and Crete. All of them had contributed to this single truth. Britain had held the line. And now, at last, the line was being reinforced. The Americans who marched through London had no idea how deeply their presence affected the British people. Many of them thought they were participating in a simple parade, a morale-building exercise, a ceremonial welcome. They did not realize that, to the eyes watching them from windows and street corners, they represented survival. They represented momentum. They represented the future. They were proof that the most dangerous period of the war, when Britain stood alone against a seemingly unstoppable enemy, was finally ending. As Churchill returned to his offices, he dictated several notes, one of which captured the essence of what he had witnessed. He remarked that the presence of American troops on British soil would mark the beginning of a great campaign, a partnership that would combine the endurance of Britain with the energy of America. It was a quiet statement, far from the dramatic speeches he delivered to Parliament or the public. Yet it revealed what he believed, that this day would be remembered not for its pageantry but for its symbolism. Night fell slowly over London, casting long shadows across buildings still bearing the scars of war. The fires of the Blitz had long been extinguished, but the memory of them lingered like ghosts in the streets. Yet on this night, the darkness felt less oppressive. The city's rafters seemed less fragile. The weight of the sky, which had so often pressed down with menace, felt lighter. For the first time in 2 years, the future did not seem entirely shrouded in threat. In the following weeks, trains carried American troops across Britain to new bases, new training grounds, and new staging areas. Their presence transformed the landscape. Camps expanded, airfields grew, roads filled with convoys. British and American officers met to coordinate operations. Soldiers exchanged stories, jokes, and cigarettes. Friendships formed. Rivalries emerged. Cultures blended. The alliance became a living force, not merely an idea on paper. Churchill followed these developments with careful attention. He understood that building a true partnership required more than shared goals. It required shared experience, shared hardship, and shared determination. The Americans, with their confidence and innovation, brought a new dimension to the war effort. The British, with their discipline and endurance, provided a backbone of knowledge shaped by 3 years of relentless conflict. Together, they formed a force capable of changing the direction of history. Months later, as Churchill reviewed strategic plans for future operations, he often thought back to the march through London. It became a private reference point, a reminder of when hope shifted from abstraction to reality, when the war's trajectory began to bend toward alliance and away from isolation. He had seen many military parades in his life, but none had carried the emotional or symbolic weight of that day. For him, the meaning of the moment was simple, profound, and enduring. Britain would survive, not as a solitary island standing against a storm, but as part of a united force strong enough to break it. And though history would produce countless battles, speeches, and pivotal events in the years that followed, the image of American troops marching through London remained one of the clearest signs that the world had awakened to fight together. It marked the moment when the future became visible, even if only faintly, through the smoke of war. Churchill never forgot it. The people of London never forgot it. And history, written with the footprints of those soldiers, never let it fade. If you enjoyed this documentary, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more incredible World War II stories. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps support the channel.